Hello and welcome to episode 402 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you this fine May 24th, Bill?
Seth, I'm doing great. Got back last night from commissioning my nephew as an ensign in the Coast Guard. It was a wonderfully successful trip,
That's
although
awesome.
I did learn that Delta is capable of lying like MacArthur. But today's episode is too important to dwell on that, so let's jump in.
Indeed. And we want to welcome the third member of our crew with us, the distinguished historian, good friend, John McManus. John, how are you today?
I'm doing great, except now, it's very disillusioning about Delta, Bill. I gotta say,
Uh,
but so it's a bit of a staggering blow here, but especially
well,
for the Army's prestige. But
no, I'm talking about not Delta Force, but Delta Airlines. I should be clear
oh,
about
oh, now I'm not
that.
surprised at all. Oh, okay.
I have a
All
Delta
right, I'm
Force
glad we had the
story, but
clarification. Okay.
yeah, thank you. I have a Delta Force story, but we'll save that for another day.
All
All
right.
right.
Before we get started, we want to ask you to like and subscribe to our channel. Please do so if you haven't done so, and if you have done so, we thank you very much. Bill, I know there was something you wanted to mention today. There was some really, really sobering, and it's quite ironic because we're
Yeah.
recording this the Friday before Memorial Day. It's sobering news, but it's also very exciting at the same time. There was a very unique discovery announced yesterday or last
Mhm.
night.
Yeah, it's so amazing, Seth. These coincidences happen so often that I don't know. I got to stop calling them coincidences because here I was up in New London for the Coast Guard Academy graduation, and while there, I stopped at submarine base Groton. I mean, how many times have I gone to school at submarine base in Groton? And of course, there's Dealey Plaza at submarine base
Mm,
Groton. So I took my
mm,
wife through Dealey Plaza and talked about Sam Dealey. And this morning we wake up and learn that USS Harder, Sam Dealey's submarine, was discovered, the wreck of it, of course, in the South China Sea. Now, this
Incredible.
submarine was a submarine that sunk by number the most Japanese warships during World War II, commanded by Dealey, of course, Medal of Honor recipient, the killer of destroyers. Um, this is one of Tim Taylor's Lost 52 project. He's doing such great work looking
Yeah,
for
he
those
is.
52 lost submarines. I think this is the ninth submarine that he's discovered, the USS Harder. And, of course, their motto was hit 'em harder. And they did indeed, Seth. It's
Yeah, they
wonderful that they found this wreck, but it's poignant and saddening the day before or the weekend before Memorial Day.
It is, and it never ceases to amaze me. I saw the pictures and some of the 3D, or I guess 4D renderings of it last night, and it's very sobering. You can see very clearly what happened to the submarine and how the crew met its eternal fate there. And
Mhm.
it'll put a lump in your throat, and if it doesn't, then there's something probably wrong with you. But
You're
it's
right.
incredible. Yeah, definitely one of the legendary boats of the war. Definitely. Well, on with today's show. So, known throughout the world as the Pearl of the Orient, Manila was widely recognized as one of the most beautiful cities in the world. In the early 20th century, Manila was seen as the front door to Asia for Western nations, and as such, the United States poured money, time, and resources into the Filipino capital. One of the world's foremost architects and urban planners, Daniel Burnham, transformed the rugged town into a cosmopolitan city, complete with wide esplanades, neoclassical structures of gleaming white, a thriving business district, modern hospitals and schools, opera theaters, movie houses, fine restaurants, beautiful hotels, and an inner city transportation system. Large American corporations like General Electric, B.F. Goodrich, Ford, and others had close ties to the city and established offices and factories there. Often referred to as a, quote, monument to Americanism, unquote, Manila pre-war was a bright spot, a destination that people sought to enjoy, and one that many people across the world had close ties and fond memories of before 1941. In the war's early days, General Douglas MacArthur, realizing that defending Manila would be catastrophic for both his forces and the city and people he loved, elected to make the Pearl an open city, and thus not let it fall victim to the fate that so many other great cities of the world had suffered thus far in the war. Now, as that same man stood at the city's gates in 1945, he hoped that the Japanese general in charge, General Yamashita, would do the very same thing. MacArthur hoped beyond hope that would indeed be the case. Yet as he stood on the outskirts and surveyed the landscape, ominous black clouds rose above the city he loved. At night, a fiery red glow shone on the night sky, clear indicators of fire and destruction. Still, Mac held out hope. The night before, troopers of the 1st Cavalry Division had entered the city and faced very little resistance. Maybe that's how the rest of the liberation of the city would go, he thought. Unfortunately, Mac was wrong. Manila would not be an open city. Manila would have to be fought for, street by street, house by house, brick by brick. Guys, we touched on this last week. This is truly one of the most heartbreaking, and we're not going to get into the atrocities in this episode. We're merely going to talk about the fight for the city. It's truly one of the most heartbreaking episodes of the entire war. It's the destruction of a great world known city. I mean, it really is. It's terrible. It's absolutely terrible.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, it's tragic on many levels, culturally, architecturally, in terms of disruption of human life and whatever else. But it just shows too, the war was going to affect everywhere, regardless. And in the Philippines too, it reflects the diversity of terrain you might encounter, because other troops in the Sixth Army might be, deep in what appears to be a jungle somewhere, or fighting for a ridge line or a hill somewhere that's with no civilization, as Americans would think of it, anywhere nearby. Right. Or the fight for the dams outside of the city, which manipulates a lot of the city's water resources too. I mean, that's completely different. And then you have urbanized terrain that many Americans would associate with big cities in the U.S., from which many of them came. Right. And so, I mean, it's just, yeah, it's really hard to put into words, but I would say the Battle of Manila is really one of the most intense and costliest urban battles in human history.
Yeah, I mean, certainly by American forces in World War II, Stalingrad stands probably above all else. But for U.S. forces, the only other thing I could equivalent it to in Europe would be Aachen. But even then, I don't think Aachen's as bad as Manila was. And
it's not as large scale too. I mean, in Aachen, we go in with 2 battalions that do most of the block by block fighting, although that takes a lot of envelopment resources too of other units outside the city, making sure the Germans can't reinforce there. The Battle of Nuremberg is sort of comes to mind too, which the Third ID especially is fighting very heavy urban combat there in a city that's already been destroyed, by air bombing. Right. But this is different. I mean, this one hadn't been destroyed until the ground fighting happens, and then one of the things when I give a talk about this, about the latter stage of the Pacific War in the Philippines, including the Battle of Manila, I show an image, and it's just, I mean, it's a leveled urbanscape that almost looks like an atomic bomb went off there. I mean, there's just nothing left except the brambles.
Kind of looks like Hiroshima. And again, we bombed cities in Europe and Germany in particular because they were German.
Right.
This is a Filipino city, right? With American citizens, American protectorate. So we did not do pre-invasion bombing like we did in Europe.
Yeah, and you're going to see that too here.
Yeah, the incremental, use of firepower, the Americans wanting to avoid bombing or heavy artillery or, whatever else that's really going to destroy a lot of the landscape. And then eventually having to resort to this. I mean, really having no other choice because they cannot fulfill the objective of taking the city, much less force protection. So yeah, I mean, it is very different than those other places that are, quote, enemy cities in a way. We got lucky in Europe that we didn't have to fight for Paris this way. We got lucky we didn't have to fight for Rome this way. We didn't get lucky here. Now this one becomes really the ultimate urban battle that Americans are involved in, I guess.
Indeed. So it all starts with a gentleman we talked about last week briefly, but Major General Vern Mudge, which is a cool name too, by the way, I have to say. It really is. He had gathered some reporters. He'd been given orders by Mac to basically, you do what you got to do, but you get your behind into Manila now. He gathered some reporters and told them that he had selected a force and issued them orders to enter Manila with all speed possible. And this is truly one of the more dramatic episodes of the Battle for Luzon. Of course, there's a lot of dramatic episodes, and this is just one, but it's one of the cooler ones in my opinion anyway. Those that wanted to go with this, what would be called the flying columns, and the first Americans to enter Manila in 1942 could go, these reporters, if they wanted to. Earlier that day, as I said, Mudge had been given orders by Mac. He'd been ordered to free the internees at Santo Tomas. And the Santo Tomas episode is something we're going to do entirely unto itself, so we won't cover that here. But Mac had been pretty blunt to Mudge, hadn't he, guys? He basically said, "You do what you have to do, and you just get into town and get there." And Kruger, he had a different opinion on the whole situation, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, Kruger really sees the Luzon battle as this kind of step-by-step tactical struggle with the Japanese to basically destroy and diminish the Japanese presence on the island. Kruger understands a lot about the actual nuts and bolts of the battles, of course, but I don't think he really has a good grasp of the strategic purpose of this campaign. And I think that's where MacArthur is really well ahead of him. MacArthur, I think, understands very well the importance of the Clark Field complex, the airfields that you've got to have that are northwest of Manila, and then Manila itself. And so the way I interpret, the way I've always thought of this, when MacArthur has this conversation with Mudge, it's really this last moment of exasperation with Kruger. The old phrase, if you want something done, you got to do it yourself. I interpret as that is what MacArthur is doing, because he's been prodding Kruger for the better part of 3+ weeks now without success. And so now he really kind of reaches deep down into the chain of command. Because if you think about the chain of command, he ought to be dealing directly with Kruger, who then deals with Griswold, who then deals with Mudge. Well, actually, it's MacArthur to Mudge now, like you said. So that tells you that something sort of special is going on. And I think it also that it shows that MacArthur has a good grasp of the 1st Cavalry Division's unique capability for this mission. That, okay, it's not technically speaking, like the kind of reconnaissance cavalry formation that we would associate with that. Nonetheless, it's an infantry division with some level of more mobility than the average division in the Pacific. So they are well suited to this, and they have 2 commanders who I think are especially suited to it. Mudge, of course, and then his number 2, Chase. General Chase, who's going to be the guy actually, with the flying columns.
Bill, speaking of flying columns, Mudge organized his strike force into 3 mobile units. Tell us about these 3 mobile units.
Yeah, Seth, it turns out here that Mudge don't budge, right? So Mudge is been told
he's got to budge.
Go through them, go around them, but get to Manila. And he does. He's got this flying column. And remember, the Kruger's army is coming down from the north through the Great Plain. Eichelberger's army is coming in from the south. Technically, Eichelberger's got a shorter distance to go, but he's got a whole lot more resistance to beat through than Kruger's does. So Mudge comes down in this, with the 1st Cav actually flying column. 2 of the columns include a Cav squadron, an armored company of M4 Sherman's artillery support, some combat engineers, and of course medical personnel, as you would expect. The cavalrymen were told to take nothing else with them but limited rations and a lot of ammunition. So 60 miles between the flying columns and the gates of Manila. You said, John, that there were 3 weeks had gone by this point, but this Battle of Manila, that's Luzon, right? The Battle of Manila is just about to begin, and that's going to go on for another, spoiler alert, another month. So we're talking about a long campaign here. And to cover that ground fast, the troopers would not be able to engage in heavy combat should they run into anything. Speed was going to be their weapon and their best ally. As you said, Brigadier General William Chase, his brigade commander, was selected to lead the columns. Chase later reflected and said that Mudge's plan was bold and dashing in true cavalry style, even though they weren't a true cavalry formation, Seth.
Yeah, you almost kind of expect them to have spurs and sabers on this kind of a thing.
Yeah, with their Stetsons. That's right.
And the Stetsons, yeah. Indeed. So Intel, John, had told the Americans that the Japanese, that MacArthur had actually believed, or one would think would like to have believed, would not put up a fight, were preparing the exact opposite, actually. The intel that had been coming in, we talked about Willoughby and what a POS he was, but the intel that was coming in through guerrillas, through friendly forces, were saying that yes, earlier the Japanese were indeed pulling out of Manila, and they were, but there were forces there that were most certainly not pulling out, right?
Yeah, so you have this weird dynamic going on among the Japanese, and I guess in fairness to MacArthur and his headquarters, there are sort of mixed signals because Yamashita famously contends that he never intended to defend Manila, and these are the orders that he is given, but he's not really in direct control of a lot of his forces, most notably the naval forces that are in and around Manila, especially near the harbor and in the downtown area. Now, to be sure, you've also got Imperial Japanese Army elements too that are in place, especially in the northern reaches of Manila. Now, where are we getting the mixed signals? Because earlier, a lot of those army units have tried to get out of Manila. They've tended to gravitate eastward. And it's also, the other thing, we focus on the urban fight, but two, the dams that are to the east are really almost equally important to capture, because otherwise, if the Japanese control them, they can either flood a lot of the area or they can deny Manila something of its water resources. So there's a lot of layers to this fight, I suppose, into what the Japanese are planning to do. So you could interpret it as, well, they're going to defend the dams rather than the urban landscape. And that's true of some Imperial Army units, but not many Imperial Navy units that feel their first order of business. And I understand why they feel this way, by the way, that their first order of business is to basically destroy all of the naval hardware and resources that are in that harbor. That is perfectly reasonable, and is also smart too, in the sense that the most valuable thing to the Americans in Manila is the harbor from which they can supply MacArthur's massive armies on Luzon and maybe elsewhere. So you have this kind of disconnect where the naval forces are doing that. At the same time, the Americans are approaching, and it's harder to get out. But you also then have this sort of question of honor that the Japanese always have too, of, well, we are honor and duty bound to defend this place, this equipment, this, whatever it is that has led you there. There's that, and also the Navy not always really acceding to Yamashita's authority.
Exactly.
So there's sort of that element in play as well. And the way this all shakes out, of course, is something in the order of about 12 to 15,000 sailors are going to be in Manila and are going to defend it, in addition to probably at least 2+ battalions worth of soldiers that are going to be in play, especially at the northern part of the city, as we get close to like Santo Tomas and whatnot.
Yeah, and most of these Japanese naval forces, and I say most, they all, frankly, are under the command of one guy. Technically it's the 31st Naval Special Base Force is the force that's in Manila, the main force that's in Manila, and it's under the command of one Rear Admiral Iwabuchi Sanji. This Japanese Rear Admiral was 49 years old at the time. He was a native of the Niigata region of Japan. Prior, and those who know the history, A, of this show, and B, the war, might recognize his name because he had a pretty promising career prior to 1942 in the Imperial Navy. Iwabuchi had. And as a matter of fact, in April 1942, he was assigned to or ordered to take command of a battleship. And that battleship that he was ordered to take command of was none other than IJN Kirishima. And we all know what happened to Kirishima. Of course, his command of Kirishima, actually previous to November 1942, had been received positively. In other words, he had done pretty much everything right. He was on a pretty good career trajectory. Everything went well for him until, of course, he ran into Admiral Willis Lee in the USS Washington on November 1942, where Washington absolutely annihilated Kirishima and Iwabuchi. And that's a story that excites us all every time we tell it, and we're not going to tell it again here. But Bill, there was something that happened, or didn't technically, to Iwabuchi with Kirishima. Kirishima, he later claimed that Kirishima, that he scuttled it. And of course, forensic evidence says, no, it was sunk by Kirishima. But regardless of this, Japanese captains had a tradition during World War II that most of them held to, but Iwabuchi did not. Right, Bill?
Yeah, that's true, Seth. Now remember, this is Saturday, November 14th, 1942. How do I know it was a Saturday? Because Friday the 13th was a special day. Anyway, so yeah, it was tradition for Japanese captains to go down with their ship. It was not a tradition for American captains to do that, by the way. We wanted to preserve the talent and rescue them because we knew they were going to have to fight a different day. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the Indianapolis, but that's another story. So he was supposed to, he said he would, go down with his ship, but he didn't. He chose to save his skin and decided that he would not die with his ship. Consequently, after the episode off of Guadalcanal, this is Solomon's area, right? His career took a different path, and he was assigned to various, basically dead-end personnel postings throughout Japan. Normally, those kinds of jobs would lead nowhere. But as the Japanese were losing the war and losing more and more their leadership, I guess he got a second life. He was brought back into circulation on November 17th, 1944 now. Remember we talked about November 13th and 14th, 1942, when he went off into La La Land. So now in 1944, he's assigned as commander of this 31st Special Naval Base Force in Manila and was put in command of all the port facilities. And as John said, it was perfectly appropriate for him to, as the Americans were approaching, destroy all Japanese infrastructure so that we couldn't use it. In December 44, he's given command of all Manila Naval Defense Forces. Now, despite being ordered to abandon the area by Yamashita prior to the American landings, he had other ideas. He was going to make up for his shame in the loss of Kushima by acquiring more shame in the events that are about to happen. He vowed to defend the city and thus disobey Yamashita's orders. His argument for holding the city was that he had to hold the city in order to destroy the port facilities, harbor, and bridges. This was, of course, a lie and nonsense. Seth, he was just out for vengeance.
He really was. I mean, I think it'd be hard to argue. I mean, to John's point, yes, he had a duty to destroy the port facilities, but he wanted to exact some revenge here, and we're gonna see that in multiple ways. So John, we said he had several thousand, upwards of 13,000-ish, I think, with the army thrown in there. He had them divided into three groups and scattered throughout the city in different ways to command. Colonel Noguchi Katsuo commanded those of the Northern Force, which is about 3 battalions worth of men. These 4,500 or so people would defend the walled city of Intramuros, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, and all of Manila north of the Pasig River. Captain Furuse Takusi would command the forces in the south. These 5,000 or so people would hold Nichols Field and Fort McKinley, blocking any efforts to break into the city from that direction. Iwabuchi himself commanded the central force, which would hold the heart of the city, the government and residential districts. His orders to his men were, quote, hold Manila City and surrounding essential areas, destroy enemy strength, unquote. So, John, he centers his forces, as I said, in the business district and residential district, and it's also around the Intramuros. The Intramuros is the walled city, as it is known. This is literally, it is an ancient city within the city of Manila, and it is a walled city, as one would think in Europe, of that medieval times, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So there's a lot of elements to this. Intramuros, yes, this is basically a vestige of Spanish colonialism. When the Spanish come, they end up building a walled city, just as you would in medieval Europe, like you said, Seth. So yeah, that is the sort of vestige of the Spanish colonial seat that had once existed in the Philippines. And of course, you have an urban landscape, much of it American influence with the architect Daniel Burnham and others who have created a lot of the like government infrastructure buildings and whatnot that is ideal for defensive terrain too in an urban environment. So let me say this about Iwabuchi. There's no question he will emerge as the #1 villain in this whole story because, of course, of the atrocities that he is directly going to order to be unleashed. Okay, but I also want to stand up for him in the sense that he's doing the right thing for the wrong reasons here. So he has to destroy the port facilities. We've talked about that. But if we're thinking about the larger sort of Japanese strategic objective on Luzon, the best chance they have to get anything positive out of this battle is to bleed the Americans. I don't know of any better way or place to do that than in urban combat. So I think Iwabuchi oddly understands the opportunity better than does Yamashita. But I don't know that he really thinks of it that way beyond, like you guys said, the revenge element and the fact that this is a guy who's going to reveal himself as just a bad person
Yeah.
on many levels with the orders he issues to his people and what they're going to do. But if we're talking about this purely from the sort of tactical and strategic battle perspective, as we are, I think Iwabuchi is doing the exact right thing, and the proof of it is in the headaches it gives us, and how long it prolongs our use of the harbor, and thus the momentum of Sixth Army operations on Luzon. The Battle of Manila, as Bill mentioned earlier, goes on for the better part of a month. Think of that, a month of raging urban combat. And these are guys who don't necessarily know what they're doing in terms of ground infantry combat, at least on the naval side, and yet they're going to be proved to be this potent. Imagine if they've been trained for it. Now they happen to be armed in such a way that it's advantageous to them because of a lot of the dismounted weapons from ships and anti-aircraft pieces and all that are going to be proved to be really effective in an urban environment. So they almost don't need small arms as much as they need just the gunnery that's going to be placed in this urban environment, you know. So yeah, again, you know, believe me, I want to make it clear, I'm no fan of Iwabuchi, but I do believe he's doing the right thing in the larger kind of context of the Luzon battle.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
go ahead, Bill.
good. What I was going to say, John, is think of Peleliu, right? And what you're saying is he's using the buildings as the Japanese did to bleed Americans using the caves and mountains in Peleliu. You know, to that extent, you're right, it's justified. But he goes way beyond that, as you said,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And
no
that is
doubt.
not justified. Okay.
And you're talking about the buildings and in the forces that are within the naval forces that are there. You almost don't have to be trained. You know, to your point, that the weaponry that they had in there that will be revealed here in the very near future is impressive. But it's the way they set up the defenses too. You know, you mentioned just a minute ago, John, that the buildings that were built or designed by Americans or Westerners, I should say, these are like earthquake-proof buildings and typhoon-proof buildings and things like that. So, I mean, these are some stout structures. These are not, you know, shacks. These are some stout structures. And the Japanese use those structures. They essentially turn every one of these major buildings, like the post office and the police station and all this, into many fortresses within the fortress that is the city of Manila. And I mean, they go to some seriously deep deep ways to defend these buildings, including blocking off the halls with like staggered sandbag and earthen walls. Says, you know, it's basically they're I don't want to say bomb proof, but they're basically direct assault, you know, proof. And it makes for you have to fight through every friggin' hallway in these buildings and every friggin' room because you don't just walk into an open room. There's defenses in these rooms, and there's like mini pillboxes inside of these halls and these rooms. I mean, this is some intense fortifications. These are some serious preparations that these people are putting into holding this city. It's they meant to stay there.
They did. And I mean, all of the explosives they've got that they've sown in an urban environment now that restricts your mobility. You've got the wide avenues. So there's really, I mean, there's no place for cover on many levels with a lot of these wide avenues in the heart of downtown. Most notably, what was called Dewey Boulevard. Obviously, it's renamed after the war, but that's a wide vista. You know, as many capitals do have, and the barricades that the Japanese set up, the cones of fire that they've got, each building, you know, it's, you know, we like to think, you know, I mean, we've got the 80th anniversary of the Normandy invasion coming up, and we think of the pillboxes and the bunkers and the Atlantic Wall and all that's famous. Well, this is already built for you in an urban environment. This exact kind of thing. All you got to do is dismount some guns and put them in there and know a little bit about gunnery and fire. So I would say if Iwabuchi had some level of ethics and humanity about him, of saying, you know, we don't want the population in the way here. Why don't we get them out of the way and evacuate them? And why don't we just fight our urban battle against the Americans? I think he would go down as an honorable hero, but that's not what he's about. He's about, like you said, just a revenge on many levels. And so what he wants is this kind of atavistic savage kind of intimate battle in which he wants the Filipinos to pay the price every bit as much as the Americans too, mainly through atrocities. But yeah, I mean, he wants to bleed the Americans, which does make sense strategically. The other thing I wanted to mention, because I really think there's a misnomer, is how we have our little pet peeves that come out over the years as we study this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You'll often hear the Japanese personnel referred to here and in many other places in the Pacific as, quote, Marines.
Right.
There's no Japanese Marine Corps. There's nothing like that. These are naval personnel, some of whom are part of a special naval landing force or the base forces, or they're
some of them are sailors, like straight off the ships too. Yeah.
Right. They're off the ships, or they're communications people, or, they're the logisticians. They're not Marines as Americans understand that point. They are maritime personnel. Okay. Because I think this is important, because when we as Americans hear that Marine title, we think, oh, well, this is a ground trained warrior, and this is somebody, a kind of hand selected volunteer. No. And so I think it creates a kind of misnomer about who you're fighting here. Thankfully they weren't like U.S. Marines in that level of training. Otherwise, this would have been exponentially worse. They're sailors who are now fighting in an urban landscape. That's who they are.
Yeah, those sailors were on Basio too, right? And so similar forces, and they did a lot of damage there, Tarawa. Right, yeah. So yeah, despite not being Marines, they could still put up a pretty wicked defense, Seth.
We've always go ahead, John.
Just one quick point. Yeah, and this also reflects the tension between the Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy, because the Navy really had its own ground forces, the Special Naval Landing Forces. And especially like at Tarawa, these are guys who really were trained for infantry combat. The guys at Manila, not as many, but it's the same kind of concept. So the Navy was always stepping on the Army's toes, and the Army any way it could against the Navy too. So incredibly dysfunctional.
Yeah, yes. We've always said that, for a Japanese soldier in defense, it's often didn't matter whether they were trained infantry or not. If they could do this, they were going to stay there until they were killed. And often, especially in this landscape or cityscape, however you want to say it, it didn't matter, because if they could pull the trigger and they had ammunition, they were going to exact some blood here. So the first Americans into Manila were men from Brigadier General Chase's flying columns. Chase, the effervescent, we talked about him last week. He's a pretty unique dude. He's again one of these relatively unknown guys. He had rallied his men together, telling them, and I pulled this straight out of your book, John, quote, kill, kill, kill. That is all you need to remember. That's all you need to do, unquote. And I mean, technically, that's really all they do need to do. And these guys, when they take off, they take off. They go, and I put it in the notes that they did go with speed. And more often than not, they did try to bypass or at least blow through any defenses, but they were stopped here and there by the Japanese. This did not happen overnight. It took them a little while to get there.
Yeah, it's going to take a couple of 3 days, I think. And so it's really a logistician's challenge, too, how they're going to keep their vehicles fueled, maintained, how they're going to keep their people fed, have enough ammo and all this. So, yeah, the pattern of that flying column fight is you're riding along for several hours, and then you hit resistance, and it's usually randomized in a way. And the resistance might be a roadblock. It could be a defended town. It could be in one instance where there's a Japanese truck convoy with troops, and there's a mistaken identity thing where the Japanese think the Americans are a friendly unit, and they wave, and then Americans open fire and just decimate them. So the whole point is any resistance you hit needs to be only temporary, that you need to move on toward your ultimate objective, which is the northern entrance to Manila. So very similar to the thunder runs of the latter year in Iraq, for instance. So the point is that you've got to have great mobility, you've got to have maneuver, and you need a lot of firepower for that. And what I think is also amazing about this is that you don't have much air power involved here. I mean, you got some recon, but really, you're not depending on airstrikes or whatever. And so you're really kind of out there on your own. And I think MacArthur and Mudge really have a good feel for the battle space at that point of what is possible. I don't know that this flying column thing would have worked, say, even a week or two earlier. But the moment has come when we can operate this way, and we have the exact right person in charge in Chase, who is very much a warrior, a swashbuckling kind of dude. And in spite of the whole kill, kill, kill thing, which he's right, he does really grasp the ambiguity of warfare. He has a lot of humanity about him. But he realizes it's like, okay, well, we have our objective, especially like liberating the folks at Santo Tomas, which is very much front of mind, especially for Chase. But we've got to kill our way to get there, and so it's really not just a matter of stacking up Japanese bodies, as almost Kruger might think of it in this sort of tactical fight of diminishing the Japanese on Luzon. It's more about get them out of our way, and the only way to do that is kill, because they're not going to surrender. This isn't the European theater, So Chase is, I think, really quite a remarkable commander, and MacArthur will realize this, as will Griswold. Chase is going to get a division in the aftermath of this, the 38th, and then eventually when Mudge is badly wounded in the Battle of Manila, Chase is going to get 1st Cavalry Division.
So to your point, 2.5 days is how long it takes some of these guys to get up to that location. And at 1900 hours on February 3rd, 1945, the first American units roll into Manila. They do go to Santo Tomas, and that, again, that's a subject we're going to cover later, and they liberate that civilian internee prison. But the Cav wasn't the only group that was heading towards Manila. It wasn't just cavalry units. It was the 37th Infantry Division as well. However, obviously, they're moving a little bit slower than these columns are that are hauling ass down the road. They've been making steady progress, although, as we've talked about before, the Japanese tried to blow every friggin' bridge on the island, and those did slow the 37th down. However, there's one bright spot where they discover the Balintawak Brewery, and we were just talking about beer before we recorded this. John, can you get into this rather humorous episode, actually?
This is just really one of the most wonderful moments in World War II, really from anybody's perspective, but especially from a U.S. infantry perspective. Because what is it you daydream about constantly as a poor foot-slogging rifleman or machine gunner, BIR man or mortarman? It's cold beer, right? Especially when it's hot, as it is. It's warm enough in February even, and all of a sudden, the 37th Division comes upon this functioning, working brewery, which before the war I think was called the San Miguel Brewery, and so it's really quite well known by anybody who knew Manila, of course, but the soldiers don't. So to them, this just drops out of the sky almost, and you can imagine how the word spreads. So it's one thing to capture a brewery; it's another for it to be in operation with nobody there and with cold beer, which Americans love so much. So yes, the beer is chilled, it's cold, which must have been, I don't know, but I'm speculating, the American influence, because I doubt if we're in Germany, maybe the beer isn't cold,
right.
But in the Philippines, yes. And so guys are just converging on it. They're like drinking straight out of the vats. They're taking their helmets and filling them up with beer canteens. That's a must. That's an obvious. Any other container we can get our hands on, we're going converging on beer. And the other nice thing about it from a command perspective is it's not high alcohol content beer. I think it's probably like what we would later think of as like 3-2 beer or whatever. So, guys can drink a fair amount of it without getting too serious of a buzz on. And it's cool. And so as the word spreads, there's this one grizzled sergeant whose unit is about half a mile away, and he hears about it, and he totally dismisses it. He said, "Yeah, right. You never get beer when you really most want beer. We're going to get beer when we're up at Baguio and it's cold in the mountains and we don't really want beer and we're freezing and whatever. Then they'll drop some beer on us or whatever, but not now." And then all of a sudden, this guy later sees it with his own eyes. He's like, "Oh my God, it's cold beer." So the 37th Division sort of, reaches the spot also conveniently to where they have to wait for the engineers to build a bridge over a water source before they can really continue their major advance. So this gives them time, which is also important, to go in and enjoy the brewery and enjoy the beer. It's just an amazing moment. So much fun.
It is awesome. It is awesome. Bill, once the American troops are reported inside the city, and it like, quite the opposite. The word spreads fast to the Japanese that, oh, hey, we got visitors here. Iwabuchi knew then that it is time to fight. He had ordered the slow destruction of port facilities in specific areas of Manila as the Americans approached. But by February the 4th, he knew the jig was up and that it was time to carry out his plan of defense. What followed, and again, I'm just going to stress this, is one of the most horrifying acts of destruction, murder, and rape in all of World War II. We're going to cover that, but we're not going to cover that today. The city's death, and it is the death of a city and the population's merciless suffering. We're going to cover that later. But Bill, by February 5th, fires are raging in Manila. This goes back to what we talked about earlier, John, and with Mac hoping beyond hope that he'd be able to capture the city intact. But by February 5th, it's not one fire, Bill. It's fires all over God's creation.
Yeah, that's right, Seth. If Chase thought he was going to simply chase the Japanese out of Manila, he was sadly mistaken. They had prepared this battlefield very thoroughly, cutting gun slots in very thick concrete walls and things like that. So the fires are raging. American forces hold a small portion of the city. 1st Cav and 37th ID just recently linked up. The city is far from liberated and the fight had just begun. Yet MacArthur proclaimed to the world that the city of Manila was now free. In actuality, less than 10% of the city was in American hands at that stage. Fires burned in the city, seemingly in every direction. Smoke rising some 2,000 feet above the buildings, aircraft overhead. Reported fires everywhere. The Japanese lit all these fires. It was as if the city had been bombed. Only at this stage did General Baitler, commanding general of 37th ID, whose job it was to break into the heart of the city, realized that the destruction was deliberate and that the Japanese most certainly planned to hold the city and fight to the death. As the Americans pushed deeper into the city, the fighting grew worse. Japanese lit buildings on fire. And when the flames spread, they tried to run, only to be caught by American infantry and shot. The Japanese infantry from the 37th ID got caught in the firestorm created by the Japanese.
American infantry. American
infantry got caught in the firestorm created by the Japanese in an attempt to escape the firestorm, sweeping the area near Plaza Santa Cruz. The GIs ran north, while the arsonists tried to escape their fires ran south. The two forces literally ran into one another, pausing only momentarily. The GIs organized themselves and put BAR men in the lead of each column. The BAR gunners tore swaths into the fleeing Japanese as the Americans themselves escaped the inferno. The GIs who got out of the area, Seth, related the run out, that they ran out like running through a blast furnace. And I've seen blast furnaces. I can only imagine what that was like for them.
John, this is one of those odd episodes. I don't want to say it's odd because it was obviously deliberate, but it's one of those things that, even when the Japanese set the fires, they were like, oh, because it got out of control really fast. And it's one of these odd episodes where these guys get kind of intermingled in this, chaotic scene. And this is really kind of just the beginning here, but this is definitely one of those odd sequences of the war, this little mini firestorm inside of Manila here.
Yeah, it's bizarre.
We got to take an interlude at Bilibid here, because there's multiple liberations, and I'm not just talking about the population. We're talking about, Santo Tomas and, Cabanatuan and all that. We're going to get to all that later, but Bilibid too. Mac had entered Manila 4 days after the first Americans did. He toured Santo Tomas and Bilibid Prison, where he saw some of his old battalion defenders. And this is one of those. Remember when we talked about MacArthur actually coming back to the Philippines, that he had a personal connection? We've mentioned this many, many times. This is one of those times. He saw a lot of people that even if he didn't recognize them by face, he might have recognized them by name. These are some of the guys that were actually with him during the defense of Bataan in 1942. When he also gets into this area, he's presented with his old car, is he not, by Chase? Chase delivers him his old limousine.
Yeah, and he visits his old home, which was a penthouse at the top of the Manila Hotel. And I really think this is worth stepping back and thinking about for a moment. compared with the typical American command experience in this war. Though many other U.S. soldiers who were fighting in 44 and 45, particularly in the officer and senior officer category and senior NCO, had served in the Philippines and had some, personal ties there. Really, nobody compared with MacArthur that way. His own home there, all the people he knew,
Yeah.
everything he knew in some respects was in Manila on many levels. So this was extraordinarily personal. There's no precedent for this really in the European theater either. So here he visits the remnants of his home, and there's the body of a Japanese colonel lying there,
Right.
like in the doorway. Most of his possessions have been either plundered or destroyed. His library, beautiful library of volumes that he had, same kind of thing. And he just compared it to like ashes in his mouth kind of thing. And I think it was very poignant that this is extraordinarily personal. I mean, as tough as the private soldiers have it, none of them are seeing their own homes destroyed like that, and their own personal. So, in terms of the guys who are liberated at Bilibid, exactly. I mean, MacArthur had been carrying this guilt about guys like this for 2, 3 years almost now. And so it was a redemptive moment, but also an incredibly melancholy moment too. And
Yeah.
I'm struck by the fact that the mood at the two liberations is really markedly different. At Santo Tomas, which is primarily a civilian ballywhack, it is like a
Yeah.
parade. It's a carnival.
Joyous.
At Bilibid, it's more somber, of sort of military discipline kind of moment because all these guys are military, and and some of them quite poignantly are wanting to report for duty,
Yeah.
and say, because they feel the guilt over being prisoners, all that trauma, that's built up and everything they've gone through. And the other thing to remember too about them, the fact that they're there means they were in particularly bad shape,
Yep.
because the folks who were in better shape in the months leading up to this, the Japanese had taken them and sent
Wow.
them to Japan and elsewhere in their empire to work as slaves.
Yeah.
So they're really just very fortunate, these people at Bilibid, to have survived at all.
Exactly. And these guys, exactly to your point, these guys are disease ridden, and I mean they are sick, and or they're wounded, by mistreatment or torture or whatever the case may be. But most of them are sick, very, very sick. Um, a lot of these guys tried to stand up, and when Mac is walking through there and they're trying to stand at attention, and a lot of them can't physically get up to do that. Those that could did stand at attention as Mac walks through. He walks among them, he shakes their hands, pats them on the shoulders and the back. um, and then there's a very, very moving scene that occurs in there as guys, the military discipline that you were talking about kind of starts to, I don't want to say breaks down, but guys start to come towards MacArthur, and they kind of start to surround him almost. And these guys are muttering, you're back, you're back, you're really back. I mean, they are truly, both astonished and very happy, but they're so sick they can't display that emotion. And Mac replies, and I quote, he says, "I'm long overdue. I'm long overdue." And he, reports are that he starts to kind of get very emotional. MacArthur does. One of the veterans of Bataan, who is dressed in a filthy pair of underwear, and that's it, and a long beard, actually apologized to MacArthur for his appearance. And Mac replied, "You've never looked better to me," unquote. So, I mean, this is a really moving, personal moment for not just MacArthur, but for these guys here. And it's again, like you were saying, it's one of those experiences that you really don't find. I mean, obviously POWs are liberated in Europe, and it's a moving scene when that happens, but not like this. This
Yeah,
is
this is
different. This
different.
is a different animal here when these guys see their former commander, and he was, walk into this room, and it's moving. It really is. It's unbelievable, to the point where he's leaving, and Mac writes, he says, "I passed on out the barracks compound and looked around at the debris that was no longer important to those inside." He writes this in his book later. The tin cans that they had eaten from, the dirty old bottles they had drunk from, it made me ill to look at them. Now, he's not referring to his men. He's referring to the detritus that's surrounding this, because he was deeply moved by this whole scene. It really, it shook him to his core, this and Santo Tomas, but especially this, I think.
Oh,
Yeah,
definitely.
Seth,
And Lieutenant Colonel Egbert, his physician, is one of the best witnesses of this. He's right there with him, and he basically, vouches for the fact that MacArthur was quite staggered emotionally by this, and he eventually says, I have to get out of here. This is almost too much for me. So what must have been going through his mind is that larger responsibility of, I should have been here with these guys. He'd always had that ambivalence about it. How could I have helped them more? How could we have gotten here quicker? All those emotions must have been coursing through him. It's really, there's nothing like this in World War II anywhere else, I would say.
Not for Americans anyway.
No,
ahead,
right.
Yes, Seth, what I was going to say is that there's no doubt that his emotion here was sincere. This is not artifice. This is not posturing. He really felt these men, and we've questioned his methods all along, and his loose association with the truth. As just in this campaign, we talked about the fact he said the city's liberated when less than 10% of it had been occupied by American forces. I mean, those mental, those decisions didn't do his people any good. And that's what we get on him for, is his, active, indictment of his own position and weakening of his own forces through, he uses the vertical pronoun all too much. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, right? Or I have done this, I have done that. That's the thing we criticize with MacArthur. He did a generally good job, I think, with the strategy of taking the Philippines back. We questioned whether it was the right move or not. Everybody can have their opinion on that. But he absolutely cared for these people. There's no doubt about it. And most of them cared for him back, but not all of them, Seth.
No, there were some people that were in that hospital, in that prison, that could have cared less that he was there, but by and large, the majority of the people were overjoyed and moved to visibly see him. He tells General Chase, who's with him the whole time too, he says, quote, I want to get out and I want to go forward until I'm stopped by fire. And I don't mean sniper fire either. John, this is MacArthur telling Chase this. Chase complies and brings Mac to the front lines. This is, again, one of those episodes where he needlessly exposes himself to enemy fire. And thankfully he doesn't get hurt, but he could have, this is one of those episodes where he just, for whatever reason, decides he has to do this.
Yeah, almost out of anger or obligation, or I don't know why he does it, but guilt. It doesn't really help matters though, because I think so we've just seen sort of the positive side of MacArthur's personal tie to this and his true caring for these folks and Manila itself, obviously. Now we're seeing the negative side, which is a kind of fundamental lack of objectivity, which impairs his judgment. And it impairs his judgment in terms of going forward to this point, to expose himself as such. He's always courageous. We all know that. We've talked about that. But also his judgment of the battle that's in front of him. It's at this point that he makes this ridiculous statement, a platoon could probably go in there and take the rest of Manila or something, he doesn't, it's as if he's now gone into sort of a fantasy world where just because he says something, then it must be true somehow. And so now really from this point forward, MacArthur is constantly having to kind of come to terms with the reality of what's happening in Manila, that the Japanese are staying there. They are going to destroy it. They are going to fight to the death. They're going to destroy the people there if they can. And we are going to have to deal with this. And at each step, we're eventually going to need every element of our firepower to come into play, including airstrikes, including the heavier artillery. And these are tough calls to make. Admittedly, you got to destroy what you love. And so I think we should all really sympathize with MacArthur on that level. But also I think that it's unfortunate that his objectivity is so off kilter here that he doesn't really understand the battle that's in front of him, and that has an impact for the average soldier too, on the kind of support you're going to get, and how the battle is going to be run from the SWAPA level, not really from Griswold's level, because Griswold understands what's going on way before MacArthur does. And so does Mudge.
Didn't Griswold say something about, I do not agree with the commanding general's optimism here? Yeah.
I don't share his optimism. Yeah, and of course, Griswold's diary is much the same kind of tone. Baitler doesn't have as many public or for our consumption comments, but he understands the fight that's in front of him too. He's a fine commander. But maybe more importantly, the average private and the average sergeant understands precisely
Oh,
what they're dealing with
oh,
here.
oh yeah.
And they know they want more support. And so that's the point of tension now in these next whatever it is, 2 weeks, something like that we're going to have this kind of step-by-step incremental thing. It's really remarkably similar, actually, to the Battle of Way, 23 years later, where Westmoreland has no idea of the battle that's being fought there. Now, partially because he's not on site, but of saying, okay, well, we don't want to use the firepower of this, or that, or the other thing, and then eventually they're going to have to figure out we absolutely have to have this. So, in that sense, it's sort of analogous. We don't want to destroy what we're liberating here, but unfortunately, we have to. That's urban combat.
Indeed. And the deeper that American forces went, the clearer it became that they were going to have to do just that. The 37th ID tried to leap across the Pasig River and drove towards Intramuros and the waterfront. First Cav enveloped the city from the east, paralleling the 37th as they moved. Eichelberger's forces that we talked about last week, of course, in detail, they're moving in from the south. This is the 11th Airborne. Manila at this point is essentially, it's not completely surrounded, but it's damn close, and it's cut off from any reinforcements. That, of course, that means people coming in, or more importantly for the Japanese and the Americans, people coming out. So basically, anybody who's there, Japanese, they're going to stay there and they're going to die. Men from the 37th 148th Infantry Regiment were assigned the task of getting across the Pasig River in assault boats. And again, this is one of those hair-raising episodes. They paddled across the river. As they paddled, the men would be under intense fire as they made their way into Japanese-controlled territory. At least that was the thought initially. 30 assault boats arrived. And we want to clarify, these are assault boats of World War II style. These are not assault boats of today's style. These are wooden and canvas friggin' rowboats. So these are not, most of them, at least not in this assault, were motored in any way with the exception of using your oar or your rifle butt to get across this river. This is not an easy task. These guys, when they get in the river, they paddle like mad, trying to get across the river and as fast as they can for obvious reasons. The sheer amount of guys that are making this procession takes a long time, at least 10 minutes to get across the river. That's not a very wide river if you look at a map. As the first wave of infantry hits the opposite shore, the Japanese controlled shore, the Japanese opened fire. These guys are scrambling up the riverbank, running into civilian gardens, and this is the urban combat that we're talking about. I mean, these are like, vegetable gardens these guys are fighting in here. GIs are taking cover from the Japanese fire. The second wave enters the river and they immediately take Japanese fire. The Japanese fire absolutely shredded these wooden boats and the men inside them. On the other side of the river, medics began setting up aid stations in the lawn of the Malakanan Palace as Japanese artillery fire. What little of it there was. We talked about this, John. There wasn't a whole lot of Japanese artillery fire in Manila because they just didn't have it. But this is one of the episodes in which it is around. Miraculously, the casualties in this assault are actually relatively light in the river assault and the artillery attack. Only 14, God bless them, Americans are killed in this assault, though. But this is an important step into getting deeper into the city, is crossing the Pasig and moving into and towards the Intramuros here. This is a major event here, isn't it?
It is. You absolutely have to cross this river. It's what bisects much of the city. It could loom from a Japanese perspective as a major barrier to stop the American advance. So there's a great bit invested in this, and it could have been way, way worse. And I think the fact that it wasn't is probably because the most potent Japanese defenses are a little farther to the south, in the sort of nearer the harbor, in the kind of the heart of the city, and the government buildings there, rather than here. And it kind of strikes me when we think of parallels, the similarity between this and the crossing of the Wall River at Nijmegen by the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Again, in a kind of an urbanized setting. Both could have been way worse than what they were. But that 10 minutes you mentioned, that's a really long, it probably felt like 10 minutes, 10 hours,
10
for a
hours,
lot of
yeah.
these guys. That's because you're so vulnerable. But you really do have the advantages over these guys in that you've got the advantage of mobility and numbers, fire support, all this kind of stuff is eventually going to redound to your advantage, but you're so vulnerable at that point. So when you have that crossing of the river in tandem with the first cavalry division kind of swinging out on the flank to sever the city from the rest of the world, the Americans really do have the initiative at this point in terms of where they want to advance. That's the important thing to take away from this, I think. And in any urban battle, of course, it's job one to cut off the enemy controlled areas of the city from the outside world. And I think the Americans do this really very well at Manila. Not that the Japanese were going to reinforce, but you had to isolate the battlefield. Absolutely.
The battlefield is shrinking too as we're moving closer and closer into the city and surrounding things. And Bill, the 148th Infantry that crossed the river and via assault boats or assault canoes, if you want to call them that, they get reinforcements from their brothers in the 129th, and they're moving towards the walled city of Intramuros. Tell us what's going on there.
Now, there's a couple of real amazing dudes that enter the picture here that are, around this area that's really heavily defended, the railroad station. And two guys in particular you want to call out here. There's a private Cleto Chico Rodriguez. He looked at the situation and felt that they could do something in order to bust the Japanese loose around this railroad station. Hailing from his nearby friend, fellow private John Reese, a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma, the Texan and the Cherokee from Oklahoma moved forward. Japanese automatic weapons fire poured down on the two men as they crept closer to the Japanese. Each of these guys had a BAR with them and plenty of ammunition. As they headed for a railroad shed about 60 yards away, they entered the shed. Some Japanese from the inside of the railroad station charged at them. Rodriguez opened fire with his BARs, did Reese, and the two wiped the charging Japanese out. As one man fired, the other one reloaded, which is, great tactics in any situation. Minutes seemed like days as the two men picked off the Japanese after Japanese, soon piling, get this, over 35 dead men in front of the railroad shed. After over an hour, they spotted more enemy moving towards their area, towards already occupied pillboxes, opening fire on the enemy horde. The two BAR men killed an estimated 40 more Japanese in a period of minutes. Darting out of the shed, the two men ran at the railroad station, diving for cover. They charged at the entrance. Reese covered Rodriguez as he threw a grenade into the building and took cover. Throwing over half a dozen grenades at the Japanese, he destroyed the 20-millimeter weapon that had been causing so much trouble and killed another 7 Japanese. Falling back with Reese, the two men raced back towards friendly lines. They would cover each other as they ran, leapfrogging one another. The Japanese, momentarily stunned by the two-man assault, opened fire again. As the two neared American lines about 20 yards away, a Japanese bullet struck Reese in the forehead, killing him instantly. Rodriguez continued charging the final yards alone. Seth, this is an incredible bit of fortitude by just two guys.
It is, and the place that they were assaulting had been a roadblock, for lack of a better term, for the American forces in this area for what, John, 2.5 days?
Easily that,
Yeah, we're talking about the Paco Railroad Station. And this was nothing to sneeze at. I mean, the Japanese, like Bill was talking about, they had reinforced this thing with, these are some of these weapons that we were talking about. They were pulling off of like anti-aircraft weapons and guns off of ships and things like that. They had, I think, several 20 millimeters in there. They had all kinds of weaponry in there, and they were tied in tighter than a tick. And the 148th literally they kept banging their heads against this wall for 2 days and couldn't get past this thing. And these guys wound up, kickstarting that action. But this Paco Railroad Station is this is one of these serious defenses that we're talking about.
Yeah, it is. And it shows that a lot of times, with all this elaborate stuff, all these defenses, as extensive as they are, the fight gets very small and very intimate.
Yes.
Where a couple of three people can have this kind of effect on a battle. I mean, and it's not just in an urban setting; we see it in other terrain too. But this again kind of tends to be the pattern that the closer we get to the spear point, the fewer individuals are really involved on some levels. And you know, and so I mean, these two guys, I can't even fathom what they
Yeah, I
did.
know.
You know, it's
They
amazing they
killed
weren't
like
both killed, but
yeah, they killed more than 82 Japanese between the two of them. It's incredible. And didn't they both receive the Medal of Honor?
They
Seth?
did, and their action it spread. It covered about 2.5 hours. Rodriguez and Reese, they're in. I don't want to say individual, but their dual action covered about 2.5 hours. I mean, that's an eternity in infantry combat. That's like 2.5 months. I mean, that's a long friggin' time. Reese's citation, and their citations are almost identical for obvious reasons. It reads in part, quote, while making a frontal assault across an open field, his platoon was halted 100 yards from the station by intense enemy fire. On his own initiative, he left the platoon, accompanied by a comrade, this is Reese, and continued forward to a house 60 yards from the objective. Although under constant enemy observation, the two men remained in this position for an hour, firing at targets of opportunity, killing more than 35 Japanese, as Bill said, and wounding many more. Moving closer to the station and discovering a group of Japanese replacements attempting to reach pillboxes, as Bill said, they opened heavy fire, killing more than 40 and stopped all subsequent attempts to man the emplacements. Enemy fire became more intense as they advanced to within 20 yards of the station. From that point, Reese provided effective covering fire and courageously drew enemy fire to himself, while his companion killed 7 Japanese and destroyed the 20-millimeter gun with hand grenades. Rodriguez's action, as citation, is almost verbatim to Reese's citation. And while Reese was killed in action, Rodriguez does survive. And yes, Bill, to your point exactly, they both get the blue ribbon, and rightfully so. This is again one of those, like we talked last week. This is one of those infantry actions that it's mind-boggling, and it's damn near unbelievable the amount of bravery and you know just integrity that these two people had to do this. Nobody ordered them to do this. They got up and did it themselves.
That's the way it usually is with these kind of acts of valor. And I should point out too, you know, the 20 millimeter, that is one of the most devastating weapons you can have in an urban combat environment. Those are a 20 millimeter is basically what you would mount on the wings of a fighter aircraft. You know, so think about that. You could shoot down a plane with it. So think about what that ordnance does to the human body. It's an extraordinarily devastating anti-personnel weapon, probably sighted very well to where, you know, anywhere you're advancing as one of these two guys is going to be vulnerable to that.
Yep.
And just one of those, just getting hit by one of them can basically take out your, you know, you're going to lose your arm and shoulder kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Much less what it would do to your head, or, you know, so that's another thing I think is kind of mind-blowing about this. When you're up against a 20 millimeter, that's serious business.
Yeah, I mean that's the light anti-aircraft weaponry aboard U.S. Navy ships. So I mean, think about that. That's a round that's about that long.
Yep.
So, pretty good sized piece of artillery there. So as the Japanese are pushed back, literally block by block, they destroyed everything in their path. Scorched earth. This is scorched earth. If they had to pull out of a building before everyone was killed, they simply blew it up after they left, setting fires all over the city. The Japanese were simply bent on destruction with no real purpose other than to be just destructive at this point. As the 37th pushed further and further, and the Cav did the same, the 11th Airborne, coming in from the south that we talked about last week, fought block by block as they attempted to link up with 5th Cav Regiment and encircle, now put the noose around the entire city. Finally, on February the 11th, the paratroopers did just that, drawing the rope tighter and tighter on the ever-shrinking area of Japanese control. We talked about this briefly, but let's talk about it now. As the fighting is raging, there are two aspects of American battlefield power that are blatantly missing here, and that is airstrikes and heavy artillery. MacArthur basically forbade the use of both, as you were saying before, John, to hopefully preserve the city that he loved. But it is abundantly clear that it is needed, and the city that he loved is dying. And it's killing American soldiers because they don't have this. So Mac eventually does relent here, doesn't he?
He does, and he has to have that flexibility, and he does ultimately. And so the airstrikes are going to come into play. The heavy artillery, especially like 155 millimeter pieces, are going to be in use, and of course your 105s and everything else that you've got. Basically, all the major elements of American ground ordnance and air support are going to be in play. You know, if we're talking about fighters and medium bombers and whatnot, not the heavy bombers, but and it's just it's an absolute must, because otherwise you're going to destroy the better part of 2 or 3 divisions there. You just are. The 11th Airborne has already reached the limit of what it can do by February 11th and thereafter at the Ganko line, because it's a light airborne unit, you know, fighting these fortified positions. The Cav and the 37 Division have more artillery support, more organic artillery support, tank support too. I should mention that as well. I mean, obviously, armor is very useful here too, vulnerable but useful. And so it's all going to be brought into play. And so where this goes is that and you're seeing this pattern in the larger war at this point. Fire becomes the sort of major weapon of war on some levels. The Japanese, in destroying the landscape, Clovis Byers, who was Eichelberger's chief of staff, claimed in a letter to his wife that the flames in Manila rose 1,000 feet in the air, much less the smoke from that. Imagine how many tens of thousands of feet that was going in the air. That's what Byers claimed. And I really don't doubt that, because the buildings were burning in such a ferocious level. But the Americans are going to start to use fire as much as they possibly can as a major weapon. And what I'm alluding to is the flamethrower teams that really become kind of the stars of the urban combat show here, and engineers using actual gasoline. So the way we're fighting this battle now, by this point, in addition to all the firepower support we've got these sort of heavy infantry squads, in which we've got bazooka people, we've got people with explosives, we've got probably at least 2 BARs, and then the flamethrower team, and then the riflemen. And we're going to try and fight top to bottom. So you can kind of hop from building to building. And so in this sense, you're controlling the high ground if I'm on a higher floor than you are in a building, you know. So they're using the flamethrowers are basically any Japanese controlled room. You stick the nozzle in and you let it go. And I can think of an account by a guy in the 5th Cav named Warren Matha. And he was a sergeant in one of these teams, and he just remembered that smell. You know, it's like, it was monotonous, you know, stick in the nozzle, flame them out, hear the screams, and then, you know, clean up in the aftermath, fire it up, and then move on to the next one. And it was just this monotony, almost like a nightmare of just constantly. If you were an engineer, it would be basically pouring gasoline into a Japanese controlled building or room or whatever, and then setting it afire. And so you're turning them into human torches as they're running out on the street, and then shooting them to death. And where it's getting to also, anytime you saw a Japanese body, because too often they're going to play possum, what you're doing is you're just putting a bullet in the head, and just whether the person's dead or not, and then stack him up against the wall, you know, so that they are accounted for. Like, okay, this person presents no further threat. The Americans are you know, trying to tamp down the stench with I think it's lime that they're sprinkling on the bodies of friend and foe alike. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's still the whole place just smells like a scorched slaughterhouse. And as we get to the climactic part of the battle, like at Intramuros or the government buildings, you've got sometimes self-propelled guns. You know, the 155s or whatever, they're just pummeling the walls, and I'm talking dozens of shells. And then, of course, at Intramuros, famously, you know, you're going to use, I think, something, what is it, Seth, like 200,000 pounds of ordnance, or, you know, something
tremendous.
Crazy like that. Yeah. So it's just blunt force at this stage.
Yeah, 7,896 rounds of artillery ammunition are used at Intramuros.
Good.
7,896 rounds of artillery. That's
each one
incredible.
the destructiveness, the loudness of it, each one of those. So the crews firing that much. I mean, wow.
It's nuts.
Think of
It's
all the logistics of transporting that ordinance to, from America to where it needs to come into play. I mean,
just the
it's really
sheer
just kind of
volume
mind-bending.
of that. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's unbelievable. And speaking of artillery, we got it, and we'll get to Intramuros in just a second. But the artillery, as you were talking about, the close combat, this is the flamethrowers, these are the demo charges, these are the kill squads, is what they are. Another game changer was the use of this artillery. And as you alluded to just a second ago, and we're going to talk about it in Intramuros, they use these 155s as direct fire. I mean, yeah, they're
Mhm.
calling in artillery fire in the traditional way, but they're also bringing these things up to, as we like to say, stupid close ranges and using these weapons as direct fire weapons to blow through the walls of these government buildings that, as we said before, are earthquake proof. Well, they're not 155 proof. To take the city hall, 155 millimeter shells were thrown from a range of 250 yards at the building's walls to collapse them. Like purposely,
Crazy.
that's what we're trying to do, is blow the walls in so the infantry can just pour in there like a rush of water. That is exactly what happens. Again, I'm going to say that again. 155 millimeter rounds at a range of 250 yards. I mean,
Incredible.
that is
And
unreal.
what's interesting about this, and I don't think there was like a direct, like, we learned this lesson sort of link. So it's what makes it even more interesting. It's exactly what the two battalions at Aachen had done. Each one is eventually supported by a self-propelled 155 that was probably their most effective ordnance. So I don't know that I ever found any evidence that the two divisions in Manila, so like, oh, okay, well, the Big Red One at Aachen used these really well, so we're going to do that here at Manila. It's really just sort of the weight of events of, we've got this weapon and we know this is the only thing that's going to knock down that wall with this level of accuracy and precision.
Yeah.
And 200 some odd yards.
250.
God, I mean, that's
Yeah. My suspicion is, though, those 155 crews had thought this through before the battle even began, right? They knew that capability was there, and this was the opportunity to use it.
But
they
the
knew what
fact that
they're
they're
capable of.
using it is incredible.
Yep.
That they have to use it is actually even more incredible, frankly.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, one thing we didn't mention, but we have to, is that another one of the reasons that Mac didn't want to use artillery is not just because he didn't want to destroy the city, he didn't want to destroy the population. Now, again, we're going to talk about the atrocities later. That's not here, but one instance of that comes to bright light here as American artillery fire opens up on the Remedios Hospital, where the Japanese were putting up a staunch fight. And it only stopped when civilians came running out waving Red Cross flags. We had no earthly clue these people are in there, obviously, despite sniper fire. There's a Piper Cub overhead. He's waggling his wings, and the artillery fire stops. It saved about 800 to 1,000 patients and refugees who eventually make their way to American lines. And I'm not talking like in a couple of days. I'm talking about like in a few minutes. These people just come out of here and they run towards American lines. Even so, 400 died, estimated. 400 died in the initial American shell fire. So this is one of those episodes this is one of the other reasons that MacArthur didn't want to use arty inside of Manila. Now, fierce fighting, and that's putting it mildly, raged on February 12th between 1st Cav, the Japanese around Fort Antonio Abad, Harrison Park, and Rizal Stadium. This is the baseball stadium, obviously. The stadium was made of concrete, obviously, as most baseball stadiums are. 15-foot high walls, 4 large stands, and a drainage ditch that could serve in the anti-tank role, which it did. More importantly, it was a major Japanese supply dump. The Japanese set up machine guns in the baseball diamond. It took 2 days for 1st Cav to clear the ballpark, inflicting 17 Japanese casualties for every 1 American loss. So again, to keep beating a dead horse, but this is combat in its most primal, vicious, just horrible, horrible stage. And now we get to Intramuros, which frankly, in my opinion, is probably the worst of the worst, guys.
I think it is. Yeah, well, and I'd also say, I'd point out, as a baseball fan, I can't imagine too many things more tragic than two
Yeah.
baseball playing nations fighting it out in a ballpark. I mean,
Yeah.
is there anything more downbeat than that? That's is there any hope for
Really.
humanity? I mean, really, this is what we're doing to each other. But that's what it had come to.
Yeah.
And then Intramuros. That's the climax of this whole thing. And within it, of course, is Fort Santiago, which had once been a dreaded Spanish prison and
Right.
eventually is going to be a Japanese place of torture and interrogation, and in a place where I know you'll cover this in the other episode. It's mass atrocities with
Oh, yeah.
more bodies there than any of us could possibly envision. But the tactical fight is again another one of these bludgeon type fights where we're bringing in every kind of shell we possibly can. So artillery, tanks are going to be a big part of this too, contributing their supporting shell fire, airstrikes. Griswold has a very uncomfortable conversation with Kruger's chief of staff, General Decker, in which he's wondering, can I use all these weapons? I mean, this is an heirloom. This is history here. Intramuros, this is the walled city. I mean, are we allowed to destroy it? What do we do? And and Decker doesn't say, "Oh, go to destroy it." He says sort of obliquely, General Kruger wants Manila taken. And so it's like, I guess that's a yes, and
Yeah.
it is, but no one wants that on the record.
Do what you must, in other words.
Yeah, and that's precisely what the Americans do. And the certain number of the wrong people are killed, just like the hospital. And by the way, let's step back and think about how that could be different under different strategic circumstances of attacking a hospital and killing people there and all that. We know in the 21st century the challenges inherent in all that. So these are the advantages the Americans have. It's a completely different strategic environment in which the population understands, I guess, some level and is still supportive of the Americans in spite of this. In other words, it doesn't turn the Filipinos against us in spite of the tragedy of this, So by Intramuros, we know all that, and it's just a matter of winkling out the Japanese defenders who were there. These are some of their last holdouts. You have that. Also, I should mention the agricultural building is where Iwabuchi meets his end,
Right.
because he's cornered. That's another one of these kind of fights like we just described. He commits ritual harikari, so it's just this, I guess the German word for it would be what, a Gotterdammerung. I mean, that's exactly what's happened here.
Yeah. And the Americans are readying their forces, Bill, on February 23rd to make this assault that we were just alluding to here on the walled city of Intramuros. Brigadier General Chase actually sends a message to the Japanese offering them passage, in clear passage of surrender. In other words, come on out, your situation's hopeless. And I mean, I think he probably already knew beforehand, before he ever sent that message, they're not going to do this, but I got to at least try. And he does do that. And the Japanese, of course, they don't even give him a response. And Chase, at that point, he's like, all right, that's the way it's going to have to be. Then that's the way it's going to have to be. Bill, at 7:30 in the morning on February 23rd, this artillery barrage that we were talking about before, it's unleashed. Tell us about I mean, this is unbelievable.
Yeah, reporters, many camped out on General Griswold's command post atop a burned out hotel just north of the river, watched these opening salvos. One of those guys named Bill Dunn of CBS said, I've witnessed naval bombardments before, but nothing to match the concentrated fury of this barrage. The artillery was outstanding. In 1 hour, they would fire, as you said, I think earlier, Seth, 7,896 rounds of artillery.
God.
That was combined with another 1,900 mortars, meaning that every second of the bombardment, an average of 3 shells. Every second, 3 shells were fired. The bombardment was pure terror for the civilians held hostage by the Japanese inside the Intramuros, as shells pulverized the ancient stones and filled the air with thick dust, making it a struggle just to breathe. We could not even, one of the guys, a survivor named Benita Lajos, said, we could not even see each other because of the smoke. We thought that we were going to die. At 8:30 a.m., a cloud of red smoke rose over the south wall of Intramuros, the signal for the artillery attack to end. and the ground assault to begin. The ensuing silence, Dunn recalled, seemed even louder than the bombardment. You've experienced that, where suddenly everything gets quiet, right? And you don't know what to deal with that quietness. The Americans crossed the Pasig River near Intramuros in assault boats again. Thankfully, no heavy fire greeted them this time as they crossed open ground and made their way into the walled city. The silence ended, however, as soon as the GIs hit the streets of Intramuros. Debris-strewn streets turned every encounter into a deadly eye-to-eye, hand-to-hand duel to the death with every Japanese the GIs met. As the Americans continued to push, refugees from inside the walled city, most of whom had been forced there by the Japanese, streamed out. American forces erected a footbridge of pontoons and boards to help with the outward flow of refugees. Over it streamed what was left of the civilian population of Intramuros. Those who weren't emaciated from the starvation of days and weeks, or wounds and cuts from bullets, wrote the New York Times reporter George Jones. At intervals in this pitiful procession came Chinese carrying litters on which lay sick, wounded, or dying men, women, and children. Seth, this was hell on earth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like John said, this is the climax of this horrific, horrific fight. The remaining Japanese in this area hold themselves up in Fort Santiago, which John was talking about. They're in Fort Santiago. I don't remember exactly when it was built, but I mean, this thing is not new either. I mean, this is, literally a prison with dungeons in it. And as such, it has a labyrinth of tunnels and everything else in it that the Americans had to go in there and ferret these Japanese out room by room. So it was an absolute slaughterhouse. Every thinkable method was employed, including gasoline and oil, which John was talking about earlier, noted 137th Infantry Division report. It was effective for when things cooled and men entered these chambers. Japs were found piled high, having suffered just as horrible a death as they inflicted on the thousands of innocent civilians they massacred, unquote. For General Griswold, who had watched the fight from a battered hotel north of the Pasig, the successful capture of the walled city came at a relatively low cost, believe it or not, of only 25 Americans killed and a further 265 wounded. Griswold wrote, quote, "God has been good to me this day, and I am forever grateful." 14th Corps commander wrote in his diary, "I am sure that the Battle of Manila will soon be history. It has been a great strain and responsibility." I think that's an understatement, John.
Absolutely. That's classic Griswold understatement. And he because he's a very humble person. And he's descriptive and yet understated, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I mean, I think Griswold was worried that Intramuros would be a complete bloodbath. That would exact, probably, 50% casualties and upward on his infantry formations. But fortunately, that didn't happen. And partially, I think, because of the fire support that we've talked about, the level of destruction, and maybe the diminution of the Japanese strength at this point, too. When these guys were cornered, they were really toast. There were some of them who tried to put on American uniforms and escape,
yep,
and are largely, spotted and killed on the spot. I mean, the whole thing is just really kind of surreal on many levels. So it's a humanitarian operation in terms of helping the refugees and getting them out of harm's way. It's a blunt force, kinetic fight. And then it's a sort of almost like a reminiscent of the Holocaust kind of moment of discovery, of finding all the victims' bodies in Fort Santiago and the dungeons, the aforementioned dungeons, and whatever else. It's such a tragedy on many levels.
It's a horror show. It really is.
It is.
It's an absolute horror show. The final three strong points, major enemy strong points, were the legislature, the agricultural, and the finance buildings. These are not occupied by civilians, so therefore we bring down the thunder, taking these three buildings, and they're virtually destroyed, or they are destroyed, in the fighting that ensues. Bill, after 29 days, the fighting from Manila is finally over. This is one of the most violent fights of the entire war, and it's the atrocities are certainly one of, not the, but one of the most heinous crimes of the entire war. Give us the butcher's bill in this horrible event.
Well, Seth, over 16,000 Japanese were killed in Manila. 1,010 Americans were killed, and 5,565 were wounded. An estimated 100,000 Filipino, Chinese, American, the various populations in the city, civilians were killed in the fighting to retake the city. The majority of them murdered. Not merely, this wasn't a simple, kind of collateral damage kind of rate. It was a lot of them were murdered. So the fight for Manila absolutely destroyed the once beautiful city. Japanese destruction, along with American artillery, flattened 613 city blocks. Indeed, it looked like Hiroshima. In the end, an area containing 11,000 buildings, ranging from banks and schools to residential neighborhoods. The battle left an estimated 200,000 Filipinos homeless and destroyed countless cultural assets and items from Filipino history. I think all three of us have been to Manila, Seth, and you wonder why the buildings look relatively new. It's because there was almost nothing left after this battle, and the city had to be rebuilt from the ground up.
Yeah, it absolutely destroyed. And we're gonna show pictures of it here in this video. But I mean, it is a wasteland. It is an absolute wasteland. If you didn't know any better, like John was saying before, you would have thought that it was a city that had been bombed and we moved into a bomb city. It's like, nope. But yeah, truly one of the more vicious battles of the Pacific War is just this 29-day fight for what was once the Pearl of the Orient. And the atrocities are a whole nother story we'll cover later. But guys, is there anything else? Say again?
Yeah. One thing to add, and the human destruction is absolutely the worst by far.
Oh, God, yeah, absolutely.
Bill alluded to this, the cultural destruction. They lose basically libraries full of volumes at the university, at the Philippines National Library. They lose hundreds of years of weather data about typhoons and earthquakes and storms and whatever that have been gathered for untold generations that are lost in weather stations. They lose the scientific data that was in museums. All the kinds of cities are these centers of knowledge and culture quite often, and this is no different. And Manila, obviously the human destruction is the worst, but there's also this cultural destruction, which also, like the human beings who have been lost, could never be replaced. The buildings can be rebuilt, and obviously, as we know, they have been. The rest of it is lost forever, and that's another element of this tragedy.
Yeah, absolutely one of the greatest tragedies of the war, certainly from the American perspective in this entire event. Well, guys, I think that's a pretty fitting place to wrap it. Is there anything else, Bill? Anything else you want to throw in? All right.
No.
Well, with that, we want to thank you very much for listening and or watching to this episode of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Please give us a rating and review. We certainly do appreciate it. If you have a question or comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. So once again, my name is Seth Barrett, and I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. John, as always, thank you, my friend, for being here with us, and we will see you again soon. Safe travels to Normandy, and enjoy yourself, and do your laundry.
I'll try to do all the above. Thanks for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it.
As always, my friend, as always, Bill, take us home.
And we'll see you again for another uplifting episode of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast next week.